This is Nigel Crawhall, for the Chief of Section for the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems program at UNESCO. And this is part of our series on capacity building for the Africa region on the research and mobilization on Indigenous and local knowledge for our greater understanding of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this is a co-production by the CABES team as well as from UNESCO. And this section, this video, is just to talk briefly about a fairly key concept that causes some debate or uncertainty, and there's different opinions on the subject about whether there are indigenous peoples in Africa. And that subject was treated by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights through a working group that lasted over a number of years. And in 2003, the working group, which represented human rights experts from different parts of the African continent, having studied the history of the question, came to the conclusion that indeed there is a specific worthwhile category of identifying indigenous communities, as the term was used in Africa, that have particular characteristics. And they emphasize the importance of the recognition and inclusion in the rights-based framework, in the political economy, of people who live by hunting and gathering, or partially by hunting and gathering, and people who live by nomadic pastoralism, as well as other types of specialized livelihoods in particular ecosystems, such as dryland farming and traditional artisanal fishing. The key point to understand about the 2003 decision by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights was part of a global dialogue that was going on at the time in the United Nations about whether it made sense to have a category of rights that was specific to communities with this historical relationship with the state and with the colonial authorities before that. And the African Asian contexts are quite distinct and different from those of the New World or of Australia. And yet, the view of the experts was that there was sufficient evidence of systematic discrimination, but also marginalization from the political economy that merited attention. And within that, to emphasize that the focus was not on defining particularly special rights for people, but to look at who is not being fully included in the exercise of their fundamental and universal human rights. So the idea that it's a type of remedy, it's a type of mechanism to address marginalization so that all Africans should have the same rights. Considering that everybody who's on the African continent of African origin can consider themselves indigenous in some way, and different constitutions give an attention to that. We have to kind of live with these two sides of the equation for Africa, that there is a specificity in addressing the rights of indigenous peoples who are ones who are living by these specialized types of subsistence livelihoods, and the majority of the population who also wish to sustain their culture and participate in the political economy according to their own identity. And so it's a continuously engaging question. But the 2003 decision was taken within the Africa region, a region that recognizes the collective nature of rights as well as the individual human rights. But then in 2007, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted its declaration, which was a global normative framework. And that was informed by the experiences of Latin America, North America, the Arctic region, and the experiences of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. So for the United Nations, our framework says that we must ensure inclusivity. We must ensure recognition of these communities with specific identities. However, in the cases that you're working in, there may be a whole range of different situations of communities with different degrees of access to power and the political economy, but also living in various relationships with the environment. And again, here we're trying to just draw attention from a research perspective, from a knowledge perspective, the idea that the evolution of human languages, human cultural diversity, is closely related to the ability of humans to access certain biological and biome and ecosystem niches. So roughly speaking, we understand that there's greater diversity of languages where there is higher biodiversity, and less linguistic diversity where there's less biodiversity. But also in particular that the use of natural resources, which is the basis of indigenous and local knowledge systems, varies substantially on the African continent between those people who are 100% 100% dependent on wild resources, such as in the Congo Basin area or in parts of the Kalahari, or those who have domestic cattle or domestic livestock, and again rely very heavily on natural resources, but in a transhumant and mobile system. So it could be that some of the work you're doing is with sedentary farming communities who are involved in the protection of the environment, let's say in a rainforest region, or some other type of characteristic like a mountain landscape. So these are all elements of characteristics of this deep knowledge of the environment, of biodiversity, of biomes, of ecosystems. But for our purposes, when we talk about indigenous peoples, we're referring both to the UN concept from 2007, as well as the African Commission decisions and recommendations out of 2003. So that is not to look at an exclusive definition, but to look at an inclusive approach, but which puts a certain onus on researchers to understand the rights of particular communities and the frameworks which create those rights. So we hope that helps as an additive component in some of our discussion around the mobilization and respect for and ethical frameworks in engaging with indigenous and local knowledge systems on the African continent.